Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
After the unprovoked Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the debate over the loyalty of native Japanese Americans reached new heights. In response to American fears, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which forced Japanese Americans into internment camps in case any might be enemy spies. Fred Korematsu, an American of Japanese descent, was one of a handful that refused the order, but was caught and forced into the camps. Korematsu challenged his imprisonment, stating that he was discriminated against because of his race. He carried his debate all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The court, however, ruled against him, stating that it was more important to protect the country than the rights of its Japanese American citizens. This court decision has been considered a failure for its sanctioning of racism, yet a success for trying to protect the country. Consequently, it has left a stain on the United States' record for honoring differences and has provided future justification for similar infringements on the civil rights of its citizens.
During World War II, Japan, an ally of Germany, had conquered Indochina and was attempting to conquer Britain's Pacific colonies. The United States hoped to halt Japan's advance peacefully, but as time progressed, U.S.-Japanese relations worsened. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese Air Force relentlessly attacked Pearl Harbor.
Within hours, the United States declared war. The attack on Pearl Harbor united Americans as never before in history. In the explosions at Pearl Harbor, there was forged the will for complete and absolute victory over the forces of evil.
After the attack, the United States feared another Japanese attack, aided by Japanese Americans, and soon spread anti-Japanese propaganda, portraying the Japanese as heartless monsters or animals. This propaganda, combined with long-standing anti-Asian sentiments and the unprovoked attack on Pearl Harbor, pressured President Roosevelt to authorize the internment of Americans of Japanese descent. Executive Order 9066 was signed by President Roosevelt on February 19, 1942. This order authorized the evacuation of all persons, mostly Japanese, who were deemed a threat to national security, from the West Coast to relocation centers that were further inland. Executive Order 9066 was intended to keep Japanese and Japanese American citizens from aiding the enemy, and in turn keep the United States secure. However, the relationship between the safety of the United States and the existence of the internment camps is impossible to discern. Executive Order 9066 had dire consequences. Not only did it grievously violate Japanese and Japanese Americans' civil liberties, it also uprooted entire communities of American citizens.
More than 120,000 Japanese and Japanese American citizens were interned. One of these interned, Fred Korematsu. He was greatly impacted and harmed by Executive Order 9066. Fred Toyosaburo Korematsu was born in Oakland, California in 1919 to Japanese immigrants. Korematsu attempted to evade Executive Order 9066. He underwent plastic surgery, trying to pass as an American of Spanish descent. However, in May 1942, he was arrested for violating the executive order. While in jail, Korematsu had a visitor, Ernest Bisig, the director of the San Francisco office of the American Civil Liberties Union. Bisig offered Korematsu the chance to become the test case to challenge the constitutionality of the internment policy. Korematsu willingly agreed since he felt that he had been stripped of his civil liberties.
On September 8, 1942, Korematsu was convicted of violating Executive Order 9066 because instead of reporting to the internment camps, he continued working. Mr. Korematsu appealed his case all the way to the United States Supreme Court, claiming that his conviction was discriminatory and that it violated the freedoms granted by the Constitution.
During this great debate, Korematsu, the petitioner, argued that removing people from their homes and trammeling them in internment camps is beyond the powers of the military and the government. Korematsu's lawyers argued that as an American citizen, he had the right, granted by the Constitution, to be treated as an individual and not as a member of a particular racial group.
The lawyer for the federal government, Charles Fahy, countered with the argument that Korematsu and other Japanese American citizens were interned under a military order issued for the protection of the United States, and that it is more important to protect the United States than to honor the individual rights of Japanese American citizens. The government also pointed out that they had proof that Japanese Americans presented a direct threat to the ongoing war efforts.
In a momentous decision on December 18, 1944, the Supreme Court ruled against Korematsu in a 6-3 decision. This ruling can be considered a significant failure for protecting the integrity of civil rights in times of war. Justice Black delivered the opinion of the court stating that Korematsu was guilty of violating Executive Order 9066.
3 justices wrote dissenting opinions, expressing that this was a despicable case of racism. Mr. Justice Murphy wrote in his dissent that this exclusion of all persons of Japanese ancestry, both alien and non-alien, from the Pacific Coast area on a plea of military necessity in the absence of martial law ought not to be approved. Such exclusion goes over the very brink of constitutional power and falls into the ugly abyss of racism. As a result of this court decision, Korematsu was forced into the internment camps.
"40 years later, Edward Ennis, a U.S. Justice Attorney, found evidence that several government agencies had withheld important information from the Supreme Court, which denied any wrongdoing by the
We
Japanese
have orders
Americans.
from my commanding
Consequently,
officer.
on the basis of government misconduct, Korematsu's criminal convictions for defying Executive Order 9066 was overturned.
When Marilyn Hall Patel was a judge, and she said that, the government should think twice before they do anything like this again. And I was vindicated.
After being exonerated, Korematsu began speaking out publicly against mass racial discrimination to prevent it from happening again. Mr. Korematsu has left a lasting legacy for honoring racial differences and maintaining civil rights. In 1998, Mr. Korematsu was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Bill Clinton.
Constant search for justice. Of our country's constant search for justice. Some names of ordinary citizens stand for millions of souls. To that distinguished list, today we add the name of Fred Korematsu.
The immediate outcome of the 1944 Supreme Court ruling has been considered a success for maintaining national security in times of war. The government claimed that there was a clear and present danger, and that it protected the government by interning the Japanese people. Yet there is no definitive evidence that interning the Japanese was what kept our country safe.
On the other hand, this case failed to honor the civil rights of the citizens interned. The internment ruined hundreds of thousands of innocent lives. Many of the interned lost everything: their homes, businesses, and dignity. Consequently, this case upheld the assumption that it was legal to imprison people solely based on race, and that it would be legal to do that again in the future if necessary.
As a human rights lawyer, I had been in the government representing the State Department on human rights issues around the world. And I knew that it's in times of terrorism or claimed terrorism that human rights tend to be suppressed.
This case has had significant long-term impact on the treatment of American citizens and their civil rights during other times of war. The Korematsu case set a precedent for the legitimacy of restricting civil rights in the name of national security. Throughout contemporary history, numerous examples can be seen of how the U.S. government has infringed on individual liberties during times of war. The Patriot Act is a recent example of a legislative decision enacted in a time of great crisis that once again values our nation's security more than civil liberties of its citizens.
This case stands as a reminder that in times of war and conflict, the shield of military necessity and national security must not be used to protect government actions from close scrutiny and accountability.